Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to a DADCAW. It's 8:54 in the evening of Saturday, the 18th of July, 2020. And this DADCAW is going to talk about a little bit of an inverse of an old classic by design video I uploaded many moons ago now, which was titled Process Over Product. Now, I'm not calling this one Product Over Process. It's more about the idea that eventually I gotta create something with all of the skills that you're mastering, or at least I don't think that it's as easy to say it was all worth it in the end. All of the lessons that I learned and the skills that I mastered and the mistakes that I made and the issues that I overcame and so on and so forth. All that growth, all that improvement, all that development. I don't know if you can say, as easily anyway, that it was all worth it if you never ended up releasing anything that demonstrated somewhere in the ballpark of where your apex was, where your maximum skill level was. And that's something that's not really been troubling me lately because, as far as I know, I'm certainly not planning on leaving this mortal earth anytime soon. I am pretty sure that I'll be around for quite a long time, and I have no interest in dropping custom content development or just content development, we'll say, in general. So I don't think that I'm ever at risk, per se, of no longer being able to improve and no longer being able to produce content. So the timing is not an issue for me, but what I have noticed is that, generally speaking, my motivation, especially for large-scale projects like Hydra that are really iterative and will very likely never be fully finished to my satisfaction. By the time we get to the point where Hydra is mostly finished, I would say we'll probably be close to developing our own RTS, and we'll probably just be tired of dealing with the limitations of StarCraft as an engine and want to move on. And I think that will happen before I feel satisfied with Hydra as a standalone product. Instead, I will have to feel satisfied with it as a tech demo and as a very large-scale, long-term experiment. Given that I've already sort of accepted that premise, I'm not really worried about Hydra's development itself, but I do constantly see, across a long enough breadth of time, if you zoom out enough and you really look at a sort of lower resolution but wider scope image, a bird's eye view on the scenario, if you can imagine that. Looking at a broad enough time scale, I see my motivation sort of wax and wane when it comes to Hydra. And that's one of those things that I'm totally okay with now. But I think when I was first starting out with the project, I was a little at odds with the idea, because most of the time when motivation waxes and wanes, it really doesn't come back. It doesn't wax. It only wanes. It only goes away. It doesn't return. You don't ever get to a point where you can say, I'm ready to go back into it and get a lot of work done. But Hydra, I've dropped and picked it up countless times at this point, and it's not really dropping in that sense because it always came back. It's more that I pushed the pause button on it until we were in a better state, either of mind or of technical prowess and understanding of the tools that we had, and just better tools outright. The scenario was better, the circumstances were better for me to actually get work done on the project, and then I picked it back up, and that's generally been how things have been. Now, I will say that it's been a trend that I've stayed with the project for a prolonged period of time, for a longer amount of time consecutively in between the breaks. And I'm not even sort of prophesizing a break in the near future either. I do think it's going to happen for a different reason, not because I'm losing motivation per se, but I have noticed a bit of a trough, if you will. There's peaks and troughs, right? Peaks and valleys. I've noticed that we're probably on the downswing. We're probably in a valley, or heading towards a valley, I should say, because the valley is also where it starts to pick back up again. And I think we're really just on that downward trajectory for now. But I can't really give you a concrete timeline as to when it would completely get to the point where I feel like the diminishing returns are too much and I just want to push the pause button on it and come back. But I suppose a seasonal aspect of it doesn't really help, right? Because we've got map crap pretty frequently. We're coming up on a full toilet that's going to be related to a campaign development that, of course, I would like to use Hydra Tech in, presumably, but also want to make sure that I'm able to add some new stuff. And that's why we're focusing on extenders to get the data set up such that we can do that. And that's also why that I'm sort of starting to use map crap as a way to explore the actual development of missions again, instead of melee maps or more sort of gameplay-driven things, purely gameplay-driven things that don't have any story element in them at all. I'm starting to try to conceptualize a world where I could produce a linear series of missions that bands together and tells a story, and where telling a story is, in fact, one of the objectives of the project. And I mean, of course, telling a story beyond the gameplay stuff, including dialogue and characters and having stuff that is represented well through the gameplay, but not purely a gameplay-focused thing. Of course, all my projects are more gameplay focused than you'll find in most other scenarios and most other contexts. But the idea behind the whole understanding of this valley thing, this downward trajectory, means that I'm starting to see a greener grass, if you will, on the approach of making an actual set of campaigns instead of constantly working on a game state and melee maps occasionally to break that up. I've mostly been working on the conceptual work for the higher tier stuff for Hydra, and also the technical implementation and some stuff related to learning Rust and other programming languages like C++ in order to ideally be able to help with the reverse engineering process, which has happened recently, I should say. But it has definitely come at the cost of enough time to work on the campaign missions that I wanted to work on. It has come at the cost of me being able to make my own personal goals of the idea that maybe I would have a playable version of the redraft to the first Terran mission by the end of this week. And obviously it is the end of this week, so that didn't happen. But looking back further, we also had scenarios where I was thinking, oh yeah, in the month of June, or maybe it was even May. I honestly don't remember exactly when I made the prediction, but I was hoping to actually have the second Zerg mission and maybe even the third Zerg mission, as well as the second Protoss mission, in some form of development, at least with most of those stuff playable. And then, of course, at somewhere down the line, I decided it would be better to redraft all of the missions, so that kind of threw that out the window. And I'd stand by the decision to redraft them, but I do recognize that it's coming after months and months of work on the mod, more so than any of the maps themselves. And so much so that I haven't even gotten around to actually exploring the AI pipeline, barring some very niche side projects, some of which were never even seen on stream. And that's one of those things that I think was probably one way to consider, oh yeah, that's definitely the case here. That's definitely the case that we're kind of, we're definitely getting work done, but losing motivation in that sense, because that is something that I want to do. I mean, the whole reason I started the project was to make a compelling single player and cooperative campaign. And the scope of that has changed over time. In fact, originally it was more. It was going to be all of Brood War, and now that seems, well, first it was a hard no, and then it became something that is a bit more of a maybe, that I'll recalibrate my expectations once the vanilla campaigns are taken care of. And that seems to be the most honest approach anyway, because who knows what's going to happen between now and the release, if the release even happens, of those first three campaigns, and of, we'll say, the first draft of the new game state, when Beta Hydra can finally start to be called Release Hydra, if you will. And that's one of those things that I think circles back nicely to the main point of this conversation, is you can iterate all you want and you can continue to work on something for a very long period of time. And I actually think that that's the best way to do it. And that's the way that you produce the most promising set of work that you'll ever produce, generally speaking. Not only the most promising in terms of what it might hold, the potential that it has, but also what it actualizes, the potential that is realized by that project. It needs a lot of time. It needs a lot of time in the oven, and you need a lot of time to get to the point where you can comfortably say, this is the best I can make it. And that is really should be reserved for one specific set of projects, or at least one specific set of projects at a time. You probably will not succeed if you're trying to do some very large scale things at the same time. I think iQuare is a pretty good example of this, because iQuare works day in and day out on StarCraft related content. For a while, it would be him working on Overlord, but most recently, he's been working on not any campaigns, not really that much custom content outside of maybe the occasional map crap like what's happening right now. But he's mostly been working on the game engine optimizations, the updates, the adding of additional AI script commands and features to the engine, and extenders now has been both of our focus, but especially him, who's worked on it day in and day out, whereas I've worked on it more occasionally, maybe a couple times a week. And that's one of those things that, while admirable, does mean that he necessarily had to take a step back from his other work, because this is something that is all consuming. Very similar to how I took a step back from Inconsummate development when Hydra development started to kick up into high gear, again, probably in the middle of March or something. Hydra development was already happening post Toddborn, we'll say. And that was when I was also exploring Nemesis development and stuff. I think a necessary aspect of the whole waxing and waning thing is you realize that you've got all of these other projects, you've got all these other ideas that you want to explore and that you want to do well, but you also recognize that they don't require or mandate the amount of effort and time in a consecutive amount of time to get to a point where they are release worthy, even if they are not a crystallization of the best you could absolutely do. Because that's essentially what your magnum opus project is. And right now, Hydra is the magnum opus, even though I don't perceive it to be the most influential or exciting project that I even have in the back burner. I just haven't actualized all that stuff with Wikidot articles and write-ups and videos priming you guys for what it actually is. And that's on me, but that's also because I recognize that if I started to do that, I would have to ditch Hydra entirely, basically, at least for a prolonged period of time, long enough for me to get to the point where those projects were off the ground. And then I would just have more projects that needed to be attended to. And that's one of those things that also is a big element of this, is time balance, but just balancing your plate, because you can have all the time in the world. I've lately come into a lot of free time now where I'm working only 2 days a week at my day job. And that means that I not only can I do these mod streams, but I can also do more video content, which is something that sort of languished for a while in the last couple of months. And I can also get more work done on offline content, like those other maps that I mentioned that didn't see the light of day recently, but that doesn't mean that they won't ever, or won't even in the very near future. And that's one of those things that I think is very important to track, because you're looking at the overall set of projects that you have. Again, consider it to be a plate, and you're trying to fill your plate with just enough that you can eat for that night, or for the next month, or whatever you want to do the extrapolation at. And at some point, you're going to be dealing with the fact that if you're anything like me anyway, you have a ton of ideas. You've got all of these concepts, and you want to explore them all. But really, it might be more convenient for you if you only had one good idea, if you had one best idea. And this is a concept that I've heard repeated elsewhere, because a truly great idea, in terms of like it's the best idea you'll ever have in your life, that's something that can really consume your entire life in terms of the span that you have, like the time that you have on this earth. That can consume everything. And I don't think I've really reached that yet. I mean, I don't even think the RTS is going to be like that. Maybe I'll be one of those people who has a ton of good ideas, but never an idea that is so all-encompassing that I need to follow it through to its logical conclusion, despite the fact that it takes my entire life to do. There's a very select few individuals, I think, that can ever get to the point where they can say, I can draw a through line from the first kind of passion that I had to the last passion I was, exercising in that sense, the last passion I was exploring towards the end of my life. I don't know that I'll be able to lay back down on my deathbed, as it were, and recount all of the StarCraft projects and all of the other projects that I'll get to in my life and say, oh yeah, there was just this one. And I'm already a quarter of the way into my life, speaking optimistically, assuming I live to be 100, right? So odds are it's not going to be a situation where I can say, oh yeah, my entire life was consumed by this, because this is the first quarter of it. And, while Hydra has probably occupied the most amount of my time so far out of any singular StarCraft project, it's probably not even the majority, because I've been working on StarCraft projects for almost a decade now, probably. And say what you will about, obviously, the very poor quality of my earlier attempts, it was still something that I was cultivating as far as a skill set, and still something that I was very interested in and I remain interested in now. And that's one of those things that I don't think too many people consider when it comes to trying to balance their situation, balance their schedule, because you're not really working just against time. You're not really trying to work around time, I should say, because you can't really work against it, but you're not working in such a fashion that you're trying to just balance your time. You're also balancing what you are going to allow yourself as a developer to work on and to even consider when it comes to consuming like thought cycles in your head, when it comes to consuming brain power, when it comes to occupying some of your shower thoughts, and the kind of discipline you need to make sure that you never think of something really interesting and really exciting that has nothing to do with what you're currently working on is very, very high. The amount of discipline required is insanely high, because at least for me, again, speaking from my own experience here, I have so many different ideas. I have so many different concepts, some of which are more fleshed out than others, some of which even have documentation on the Wikidot, either listed or not. And that stuff for me is stuff that I really want to explore at some point. But either I haven't given myself enough time to justify the project itself, to really explore it in a conceptual stage and say, okay, does this graduate from conceptual into something that I want to actually work on? Like, do I think it's actually something that needs to be worked on in that sense? Or if it's not that, if it's not the fact that I just haven't given myself enough time, it's that maybe that I have already explored it and I know I would need to revisit it at a later date to try to re-engineer it into something more valuable, more promising again. So you got to make sure that you're able to stick with one kind of overall large-scale project at a time, I think. Unless you're really blessed with a huge amount of not only time, but also multitasking ability, to the point where you don't mind jumping into the headspace of, say, for the first 3 days of the week, I'm going to do this project, and for the next 3 days, I'm going to do that project, then I'll have a day off where I can do whatever the fuck I want. that might be one way to balance it. And maybe in an imaginary world where I don't have to work at all any week, that might be something that even I can say, oh yeah, that's fine, I can do that. Although I don't think so. But there's situations, I think, where it just pays to be able to say, for the next however many weeks, months, whatever, I'm going to be working day in, day out on this project until my interest wanes, until the project is done, whatever. And the reason why I'm bringing all this up partially is because I do, like I said, I foresee, but I can't exactly prophesize when it will happen. I do foresee a point where I decide to put a pause on Hydra. That doesn't mean that I wouldn't be working on the mod itself and try to resolve bugs. I think I would like to get it into a position where I can say it's a stable product. It's got some single player content for you to be able to partake in. And I'd probably, update Stormborn before I really dropped everything related to Hydra anyway, because I want to make sure that there's large scale as well as smaller scale single player content. And so maybe we have a small handful of single player / co-op maps. Maybe we have a small sample of scenarios made by other people like Kian. And maybe we have a small sample of melee maps, as we already do. Maybe that grows even larger in the next couple of weeks to months. And once we have the content itself to support the project, and once the project itself is in a solid state, that would be something where I would feel comfortable deciding to move on to something else. Most of my other projects will be using Hydra anyway, at least in some part, if not in full. And as a result of that, I don't think that I would completely drop new game state development, but it would definitely take a backseat to whatever I was deciding to do next, be it map design or campaign planning or whatever, voice acting, AI writing, that sort of thing. And some of these projects, like Toddborn and like Ahmed's Adventure and so on and so forth, there's many projects that I have that are not necessarily mutually exclusive with Hydra, especially with the extenders. I might be able to just add those things to the game state, and then you can play anime versus Zerg matchups or whatever. But in theory, they do not really allow you to easily merge the two code bases. And even if they did, you would be focusing on one set of races in that sense. And instead of focusing on the entire thing and trying to balance it all together, you'd mostly be working on the races that were pertinent to the project. And in that sense, I don't think that you would see a huge amount of Hydra specific changes come into play, because it wouldn't be necessary for the project. And that makes sense to most people, I would imagine. And that's where we come to at the end of this DADCAW, is I look at Hydra itself and I know it's going to take a very long time before either we're ready to move on to our own RTS, or I'm satisfied with the project and I can call it quits for the time being, or maybe even permanently. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to have more hills and valleys, as I spoke of earlier. And this sort of traceback path that you can trace back is one of those things that allows you, I think, to compare it to your own experience working on content. And when you consider all of the different projects that you never finished, and all the different projects that you made a habit of, as soon as you lost motivation or soon after you lost motivation, you dumped the project never to return to it. I'm not necessarily encouraging you to go back to those old projects and resurrect them and try to reactivate them and get more work done on them. I don't believe that that's necessarily something that you even should be doing, because it's one of those things that definitely requires a significant amount of introspection as to what are my skills right now, and also qualitative analysis of the project itself and saying, does this even reflect the kind of concept or the kind of project that would allow me to demonstrate my skills, but also be interesting to me as a player, and more so than just a developer. But also, of course, be interesting to me as a developer. Does it represent some sort of challenge that I've never experienced or haven't experienced recently? And if so, then that can be something that you explore. So that's one of those things that I think everybody can take a look at and sort of internalize and try to discuss amongst themselves, more or less. Where have I expressed this kind of behavior before? Where has this happened to me before? Where I've lost interest, canned a project? I mean, this happened to everybody. Is it a repeating thing? Is it something where you constantly start and stop projects? Again, not to say that maybe it wasn't the right decision to start and stop a project, or to drop a project completely and never return to it again, because many projects, especially older projects that we started to work on in our youth or in our younger years, of course, they predate certain aspects of our standards and our personal goals when it comes to content development. So those may never be useful for us in that sense. And maybe there can be some other circumstances, like obviously I've got my brother's birthday that happens obviously once a year in January. And that's one of those things that for me is a special circumstance that allows me to justify a project, even if maybe qualitatively I should probably be working on something else. Or even if I look at myself and I say, well, what am I really interested in? It might not 100% be the birthday project that I work on for him. It might actually be continuing to work on Hydra or working on something else or whatever. And as a result of looking at your past behavior anyway, with this idea, this phenomenon of dropping projects, regardless of what the reasoning might be, consider whether or not it might be better to just pause on the project and return to it when you feel more motivated. Consider if it's even something that makes sense to consider a project that requires long-term commitment. Is it a project that is actually relatively large scale? Is it a project that requires a large amount of external skills mastered? Like, do you need to learn a new skill? Do you need to do a lot of legwork that isn't directly related to it, like related to reverse engineering, for example? Do you need to do a lot of that? Even if you have the skills already, that can be quite taxing. And that definitely means that the project is probably more on the large scale section, even if the content that you'd be producing under that project's term, under that project's umbrella name, doesn't necessarily amount to a huge amount. You know, it might not be a 30 map campaign. Maybe it's only a 6 or 7 map campaign. But if you require a huge amount of reverse engineering because of some new system you're trying to add, that can be a situation where, yeah, you're starting to consider that a large scale project, and maybe you can try to envision some other utility for the reverse engineering things that you're doing in the meantime that might allow you to remain motivated to do those reverse engineering aspects, and then actualize them inside small projects that you can sort of start and stop, drag and drop the same way that you might with a map crap or something similar. That can definitely be something that's useful. And again, to circle back to the allegory that I made to the by design video itself of it being considered, you know, it's more important for you to master your process and work on your process than it is to work on a single project. Again, I'm not 100% convinced that it's easy to say that everything is peachy clean or peachy keen rather, and something that you want to look back on and say, yeah, it was worth it, if you don't release something that's, you know, exemplary of your skills in this particular case. And that's one of those things that everybody can learn from. Everybody can try to do. At some point, you gotta say, am I ready to make a project? And I think the answer obviously depends on what kind of project you're talking about. So maybe you can find a smaller scale project that you're more interested in. Maybe you can find a project that is larger scale and you don't mind saying, hey, this is a project that is going to take a long time, so let's start to work on it. And whenever my motivation starts to wane, instead of dropping it and calling it quits and abandoning it completely, I'm going to just push pause and work on something maybe related in some assets. Maybe I can, you know, take some aspect of that project and say, I can reuse this for my side project or whatever. And of course that can help rekindle your motivation to work on the main project anyway, because it's still using some aspect of it, maybe some graphics, maybe some code, maybe something like that. And there's all these different ways that you can find some capacity to improve your, I think your motivation in general, but also the idea of having a diverse portfolio of projects in the first place to pick from and say, I want to work on this now. There's an advantage to that, despite the tripwires, like the pitfalls that might become you. There is an advantage to it, because if you consider the idea that you'll pretty much never run out of some sort of excuse to work on something, because there's always so many different projects for you to do. In that sense, you can get the daily grind aspect of it. You can make that a regular habit. Even if you're always working on something different every week or something, it can still be useful enough. Like if you had a map crap every single week, yeah, it would be something different every single week, but you'd still be working on StarCraft content every single week. And that can be something that maybe it's not a daily grind for you, but maybe it is a weekly grind. Maybe a couple times a week, you do some work on that and you finish a map. And there's something to be said for that, even though the quality will obviously not be as high as if you dedicated all that time and effort and consistency and discipline into one single project that spans however much scale, big or small. And these are just some ways that you might be able to conceptualize the challenge of staying with the same project for a very long amount of time, like I have with Hydra and like other people have with other things. And you might be able to take something positive away from that experience of looking inside oneself and say, hey, what's going on here? Why am I dropping this? Or why is my motivation dropping in general? Maybe I'm not abandoning it, but I am kind of low on motivation. And maybe all you need is a bit of a break. So it's a very long 25-minute way to say you might have some burnout issues. You might be ready to get to work on something else. But that being said, still something that you might be able to learn. And hopefully the journey from point A to point B, from minute 1 to minute 24, helped you to understand what exactly it was I was saying. And I think I'm going to have to re-listen to this anyway to figure that out, because I probably lost the plot at some point halfway through. But like I said, hopefully it was at least interesting enough that you got something from it. And that is where we will end this DADCAW. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you soon.